Hi, everyone. Our last lecture today is on ancient Rome. So we're going to be talking about the Colosseum today, which is pictured right here, and some other probably familiar things about ancient Rome. So we're going to start with the geography of Rome. And the legend goes that, Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, these two twin brothers who had been thrown into a river because the king was afraid that one day they would overthrow him. And so they were rescued and nursed back to health by a mother wolf. And they went on to found the city of Rome in 753 BCE along the Tiber River. So the Tiber River is going to be really key to Rome. It's located on a waterway, good source of water, and it's going to make the soil really fertile. And so Rome is founded on the Seven Hills, really easy to defend and of central location, centered in the middle of the Italian peninsula at the center of the Mediterranean Sea, and the Mediterranean was at the center of the Western world at the time. Now, Roman society developed from the Etruscans, who took power in 600 BCE. And the Etruscans had an influence on Rome, on their religion. They used the Greek alphabet, which the Romans then adopted for themselves, and they also influenced the really famous Roman garment, the toga. Which was used in ancient Rome. Eventually, the Romans grew to mistrust the Etruscan kings, and so they defeated them in 509 BCE and went on to establish a Roman republic, one that would not have to rely on just one ruler. So, a republic is when citizens have the right to vote and they elect their own leaders. Now, this isn't going to be everyone in Roman society. It's going to be men who have the right to vote in ancient Rome. But they're going to have a Senate and then two consuls. Now, the consuls are two chief officials who had 1 year terms. They could only rule for 1 year. And they had to agree on what action was going to be taken together. One could veto the other one, meaning to reject the plan of action, but in general, the two consuls had to agree in order for some sort of policy to be enacted. The Roman Republic also allowed for an emergency dictator to rule for 6 months in the event of an emergency, which is going to come into play later on. And we see this all throughout world history where, in a time of crisis, when a ruler or the government will take on extra powers in order to cope with a crisis. But that's usually temporary, but it usually does leave a lasting impact on that government. And so we'll see that take place here in Rome as well. And then we have the Senate, the most powerful government, or part of the government in ancient Rome. They advised the consuls on foreign affairs, laws, and finances, and had influence over the economy. And the Senate was made up of 300 patricians. Now, the patricians were the wealthier members of society, people who came from upper class families in the Roman Republic. So they're going to have the most power in Rome. Now, we also have the plebeians. They're the ordinary citizens. So you have the plebeians and the patricians. The plebeians at first could not hold office or be senators until 367 BCE, when a new law required that one of the council members be a plebeian. So you had one consul who was a plebeian, one who was a patrician. And then plebeians were also allowed to join the Senate and be elected to the Senate. Rome eventually started to expand across all of Italy in the first 250 years of the Roman Republic. The patricians benefited most from this conquest. They gained a lot of wealth and slaves as they took over more land, and the patricians used that land to create latifundia, which are large farms. The plebeians, on the other hand, who are the ordinary citizens, they're the ones who are doing a lot of the labor until those slaves come in to replace them. So this created a lot of tensions between the patricians and the plebeians, especially as the patricians were gaining more and more wealth and influence. So eventually the plebeians decided to refuse to fight in the Roman army. They formed tribunes to represent their own interests, and eventually the 12 tables were passed, which was the law code in the Roman Republic, which applied equally to all the citizens. This helped to relieve some of those tensions between these two classes of citizens in Rome, the patricians and the plebeians. Now, Rome also started to expand beyond the Italian peninsula. First, they invaded Carthage, which is here in North Africa, in what is called the Punic Wars. They also seized control of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. They conquered pretty much all of Greece and some of the Greek holdings here in Asia Minor, and took over some of the land in Gaul. Now, this is the Roman Republic still. We're not quite to our empire, but we're seeing this influence of imperialism throughout the Mediterranean Sea. Now, eventually, the Roman Republic declines. There was a lot of unrest in Rome, and Roman generals were starting to build up their own private armies and competing with one another for power. And this caused a lot of civil disorder. Private armies were murdering their enemies, consuls didn't respect each other's veto power, and so this caused a lot of strife in the Roman Republic. And so Julius Caesar, being a general himself, used his own loyal army to seize power in 48 BCE and established a dictatorship. Now, remember, initially, the Romans allowed a dictator in times of crisis, such as this, where we have all this unrest. But Julius Caesar took that a step further, and he became the sole consul and named himself dictator for life. Instead of that 6 months of a dictatorship, he named himself dictator for life and would rule until the end of his life, which ended March 15th, 44 BCE. So, not a very long reign. He was invited to a Senate meeting, and there the senators killed him, assassinated him. And so, after Julius Caesar is assassinated, we see 13 years of civil war in Rome, and this causes the end of the Roman Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire. Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, gained power in 27 BCE and ends the civil unrest that brought the end of the Roman Republic. The Senate renames him Augustus. He's known as Augustus Caesar or Caesar Augustus, and he officially establishes the Roman Empire. Now, beginning with Augustus, we see a 200-year period of peace and stability and prosperity in Rome known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. During this time, trade flourished between Asia, Africa, and the Roman Empire. Rome expanded their territory and ushered in, like I said, this period of general prosperity for the Roman Empire. Now, as Rome was conquering more and more lands, their major goals were to maintain peace in the lands that they conquered, to gain raw materials from those places, to collect taxes from the people who lived there, which would create a lot of wealth for Rome, and to promote trade. Now, they did enslave some of the people that they conquered, but most of the conquered people were kept free. They were allowed to practice their own religions and speak their own languages, but a lot of them adopted a lot of the Roman traditions like Roman religion and language. And in order to control such a large empire, the emperors divided the empire into provinces. So you would have different areas of the empire that were controlled by a governor and an army there to support him. And they would oversee what was happening all throughout the expansive empire. Local rulers were allowed to run daily affairs in most of the places that the empire took over, but you had this sort of umbrella government in the governor and the armies who ruled there. So this is the expanse of the Roman Empire. So we see these areas that we looked at before under the Republic. We've seen in North Africa, they've expanded quite a bit. They've taken over the rest of the Iberian Peninsula, all of modern-day France, up here into the Netherlands, a little bit of Germany, and into Britain, all the way up to Hadrian's Wall here, named after one of our emperors. And then out here into the Middle East and Mesopotamia, they had control of Syria and Judea, and then down the Nile River here. So quite an expansive empire. And then I just wanted to point out here, we have Germania up here in Northern Europe. There were tribes living here, Germanic tribes, that are eventually going to place pressure on the rest of the Roman Empire down south here. So, a couple of Roman emperors I want to mention. Two bad emperors, Caligula and Nero. Caligula was the third emperor, and he was known for being very cruel and unfair to the Roman citizens. And he was eventually assassinated for his reign. And then Nero, the fifth emperor, who is best known for murdering most of his family, murdered his half brother, his own mother, and his wife, and a lot of other people. And so eventually he was sentenced to death by the Senate. But he avoided that sentence by committing suicide. I believe he stabbed himself in the neck with a dagger. Now, we also have the five good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, who's known for making the laws uniform, reorganizing the army, and encouraging learning in the Roman Empire. We also have Antonius Pius and Marcus Aurelius, who's known as a great emperor. And unfortunately, Marcus Aurelius' son, Commodus, is usually marked as the beginning of the end of the Pax Romana and the beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire. Now, the Greeks had a lot of influence on the Romans. The Romans studied a lot of the Greek art, architecture, and political ideas, and they especially had an influence on Roman religion. They were both polytheistic religions, and for many of the Greek gods, there was a Roman counterpart to that god. So, for example, the Greek god Zeus. The Roman god Jupiter had many of the same characteristics as Zeus. Same for the goddess Athena in Greece. The Roman version of that goddess is Minerva. Now, the Greeks had a large influence on architecture and technology in Rome, but eventually the Romans developed their own unique style. They started using arches to help save building materials and concrete. And they built the famous Colosseum, which was the picture on the beginning of our slides here. This was a site for contests and combat between people and animals. They would even fill the Colosseum. It was designed to fill with water so they could have naval battles on the water in the Colosseum as well. The Romans are also famous for building an extensive network of roads. If you stretch out the Roman roads, you can go around the earth twice. And then they also are really famous for building the aqueducts, these structures that carried water over large distances. And so you would have these archways, and they would span for hundreds of miles. This one in particular is in Segovia, Spain. Just more evidence that the Roman Empire expanded all over the Mediterranean basin, not just in Italy. Now, you can't talk about the Roman Empire without talking about Christianity as well. Now, I mentioned that Romans had control of Judea, which was the ancestral homeland of the Hebrews, or the Jews. The Jews believed that a Messiah would come, a savior, who would bring justice and freedom from Roman rule. And so Jesus, who is known as the founder of Christianity, he was born in Nazareth to a poor family and eventually became a carpenter, which is what he worked as until he was about age 30. He eventually started gathering disciples or followers and began traveling around and teaching that there was only one God, that God was loving and forgiving, and that if you believe in God, you will have everlasting life after death. He also preached a pretty radical idea that people should not only love God, but love each other. Love thy neighbor as thyself is a major tenet of Christianity. Now, the Romans grew very fearful of Jesus. He was gathering a lot of people behind him, and he was preaching that he was the king of the Jews. Of course, this is metaphorical. But they were afraid that he would eventually lead a revolt. And so the Romans crucified Jesus, meaning they put him to death on a cross, which is supposed to cause suffocation. So what they would do is they would tie your hands up and your feet down at the bottom, and you would eventually suffocate. But according to the Christian Bible, Jesus was beaten particularly bad, and Christians believe that Jesus' death represents a sacrifice for the sins of the world, and that if you believe Jesus lived and died for your sins, you can experience that eternal life. The life of Jesus is recorded by the disciples in the Gospels. So the first 4 books of the Christian New Testament in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they were written by those, their respective disciples. Now, Christian is derived from the Greek word for Messiah, which is Christos. People started calling Jesus the Christ. And so a Christian is a Christ follower. So there were a lot of Christians who helped spread Christianity throughout the Mediterranean basin and eventually beyond to all parts of the world. And one of these Christians is Paul. Paul was originally a Christian killer. His name was Saul, and he was responsible for putting a lot of Christians to death. But as he was traveling to the city of Damascus, he had a vision which caused him to leave his old life behind and convert to Christianity. He renamed himself Paul and devoted his life to spreading Jesus' teachings throughout his world in the Mediterranean. And he did this by traveling, and he wrote a lot of letters or epistles to different Christian groups. And these writings helped to turn the Christian faith into an organized religion that we now call Christianity. Now, Christians in the Roman Empire refused to worship the Roman gods. They're supposed to only believe in one God, and so they refused to practice polytheism. And so a lot of emperors, including Nero, persecuted the Christians, blamed them for various things that would go wrong in Rome. For example, there was a fire in Rome in 64 CE. The Christians were blamed for that. And they were also blamed for a lot of other issues around the empire. So Christians were often executed for practicing their religion. But even so, Christianity continued to spread throughout the Roman Empire. Christians preached a hope for a better life after death, and they were also known for their charity to orphans, widows, and the poor. And so this appealed to a lot of people in Rome. Christianity eventually becomes the official religion of Rome under the Roman Emperor Constantine, who reigns from 312 to 337 BCE. And the legend goes that Constantine was about to go into battle, and he saw a cross in the sky with some words that told him that if he believed in God, he would win the battle. And he ended up winning that battle. And so people cite that as the reason that Constantine converts to Christianity and then makes Christianity the official religion of Rome. Now, like all empires, Rome fell. And like I mentioned before, the decline begins under Commodus, Marcus Aurelius' son, in 180 CE. Now, we've got a couple hundred years still before the Roman Empire officially ends, but we have a couple of different factors. Internal factors, things that are happening within the Roman Empire, and external factors, some outside influences that are going to bring about the fall of Rome. So we're going to start with the internal factors. First, the leaders in Rome were corrupt and weak. The empire had lost a lot of political and economic stability. And so we see a lot of violence, assassination of emperors, and a lot of generals who were in power, but they were better as generals, not really as rulers. So we have some big weaknesses in the leadership of Rome. We also have mercenaries, who are foreign soldiers who serve for pay. Now, oftentimes they would switch sides depending on who was going to pay them the most. They weren't loyal to the Roman Empire, so that creates some gaps in the effectiveness of the Roman army. The empire also eventually grew too large to be governed. And so the empire started losing a lot of territories and controls, especially in the more distant areas of the Roman Empire. And so Emperor Diocletian comes along and he splits the empire into two halves, the eastern half and the western half. So that's going to cause weakness for the empire as well. And then Rome also faced a lot of economic difficulties. They had to increase taxes to pay the military. And there was a lot of unemployment, so it made it difficult for people to pay those taxes. There were also food shortages and inflation, which means that there's more money in supply, but that money has less value. So eventually the Roman coins became worthless, which is not something you want for your economy. Emperor Constantine, when he comes along, he moves the capital from Rome in Italy to a city called Byzantium in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. He renames it Constantinople after himself. And so we're starting to see a shift of power to the east, that eastern half of the empire. Now, eventually, the fall of Rome comes with these external factors of the Germanic tribes, those tribes I mentioned in Northern Europe. invading Rome. And they do this because they are facing their own pressure. Attila the Hun and the Huns came from the east, from Asia, and they started invading Eastern Europe. And so that placed a lot of pressure on the Germanic tribes to move south. And so we're going to see those tribes eventually take over in Rome. We have the Visigoths who captured and looted Rome in 410 CE. A few decades later, we get the Vandals, another Germanic tribe who took over in Rome. And then finally, Rome officially falls in 476 CE when a German general seized control from Emperor Romulus Augustulus. And so that western half of the Roman Empire officially ends in 476. But the Eastern Empire becomes a new empire and it lives on. It becomes the Byzantine Empire and reigns until 1453 CE. So several hundred years after the western part of the empire falls. And that is the end of ancient Rome. We'll see different areas of the western half of Rome eventually evolve into our nation states of Spain and Germany, Italy, and France and Britain. But we still have a little while to go before we get to that part. All right. So that is it for Rome. Thank you.